Hello, everyone, and welcome to Anatomy of an Adaptation. This is a podcast that aims to compare and contrast classic novels with their cinematic adaptations. I'm your host, Nicolo Grasso, and I'm joined today by a good friend of mine, fellow podcaster, fellow film lover, fellow book lover, Carson Timar of Clappercast. How are you doing, Carson?
I'm doing great. This has been an episode of just like a podcast that I've wanted to do for a while, and I think this is probably the best space to have this conversation. So I'm very excited today. Yeah.
Definitely. This has been a long time coming for me. A long time coming for this podcast as well. I remember back when I started it, when I was with the good Yuan and Galedo, I said it would be nice, to do an episode on Wild at Heart. And then we just never did. Never did. In December, started up again with you talking about queer. And I said, you know what I really, really would like to do? I really would like to do that Wild at Heart episode. And then, as everyone knows, come mid January, David Lynch passed away. A big influence of mine, a new love of sorts, we could even say for you, Carson, right? We ended up doing this big, which I highly recommend everyone listens to, this kind of like mini retrospective deep dive on Lynch back in December on Clappercast. And so it felt right. I didn't want to kind of like rush this. I didn't want to, I hate the term like capitalize on his path and be like, that's the time, guys. Like, SEO, the click, the clicks, people are looking for it. So I was like, no, let's just wait a little bit, give it a couple of months by the time of recording almost. And yeah, we're officially talking about Barry Gifford's Wild at Heart and the 1990 David Lynch adaptation.
Peanut!
Hey, baby!
Wow.
Baby, I got a surprise for you.
Hey, my snakeskin jacket! Thanks, baby! Did I ever tell you that this here jacket represents a symbol of my individuality and my belief in personal freedom?
About 50,000 times. I got us a room at the Cape Fear. And guess what? Powerman's playing at the Hurricane.
Stabbing and steer.
So Carson, this was the first time for you reading Wild at Heart, right? First time also reading Barry Gifford, I imagine. This American novelist, poet, and also screenwriter, as we'll see. Wild at Heart is part of a series of novels. The first one was published in 1989, 1990, more or less, very close to when the film almost came out. It instantly went into production, but the book is part of a series titled The Wildlife, The Wild Adventures of Sailor and Luna, depending on the on the collection you end up finding, which is right now a total of 7 novels. Back at the end of the 90s, it was 6 novels that focus on this wild, weird romance between Sailor and Lula, these two romantic youngsters that are keep getting torn apart by the world, by crime, very upset, possessive mothers, criminals, murders, bank robberies. Everything is happening around them, but only their love endures, survives amidst all of the chaos of this wild, wild world. What was it like for you reading Wild at Heart for this first time?
A super interesting experience, right? Because I had seen the David Lynch film before. So I already had like his visualization and his take on this world and these characters in my head. And it's really interesting reading the book then because a lot of it's on the core level the same. I think this is overall a pretty faithful adaptation in some ways, except the characters read very, very differently. I think a perfect example of this is very early on. There's a scene where she is discussing her history being raped by her uncle. And in the movie, it's the same conversation up until the end point. In the book, it goes to him then naked on the bed with an erection being like, that turns me on. I want to fuck you. Movie, very different conclusion to that scene. It is definitely just more like slimy, oily, gross, but in a way that's still like quite intoxicating. I really like how this movie or how this book, excuse me, projects Americana and projects kind of this dirty underbelly, but it's in a way that is so much dirtier than Lynch's work, I think, and in a way that is very, it just the emotions of it and how you read these characters, how you read this relationship There's also a lot more with the mother that I'm sure we'll get into. But I appreciated it as just it's a very different, it's the same story but through a very different lens, and it's one that I still thought was very effective. It was quite it was interesting putting these two in conversation with each other, the book and the movie. But I enjoyed the book for sure.
Yeah, it's quite something, isn't it? I think I this was actually my second time reading the book. I first read it, I want to say back in like 2018, 2019, because I remember loving the film the first time around, and I thought, oh wow, it's a book. Let's just read the book. Oh, it's super short as well. Let's do it. So I used to read it like commuting to uni, back and forth. I read it in like a couple of days, and I was left pretty disappointed back then. But I'm glad I waited 7, almost 8 years at this point, to read it again, because I actually ended up really, really appreciating it. There is almost loving it this time around. Something just clicked that didn't before, and I think one of the main differences, or at least like shocking points for me back then, was that not only is this book made up of like 50, 40, 50 very, 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 very short chapters. We're talking chapters that last 1 or 2 pages. On average, it's like a 2 page chapter, which already makes it just such a quick read, in my opinion. The same book, if it's split in just like, I want to say, 5 chapters, is going to read much differently. But having these constant breaks, you're switching from one character to the other. It keeps it refreshed, it keeps it engaging, it never tires you down. But also, this is primarily, I don't even want to say it's a character driven piece, but it's dialogue driven, but not in a way that one might think. This is almost anecdote driven. It's essentially a road trip movie, a road trip story, where in every single chapter someone just talks about a person they met, a book they read, a film, a memory, what they heard on the grapevine. It's always like that, which takes, at least the first time around, it took a little while to get used to. I don't think I ever got used to it, honestly, because I had the memory of Lynch's film so fresh in my mind. But knowing what I was getting myself into, and especially having read some of the inspirations for Barry Gifford, I was looking into him, and he's a big fan of the Beat Generation. Of course, we talked about, we mentioned Jack Kerouac a couple of times. We talked about um, Burroughs, of course. So some of that meanness, some of that Americana that you were talking about, kind of like how life really is, quote unquote. The way that Gifford presents it is very heightened, very stylized, and very raw and raunchy. And yes, as you mentioned, this book goes places in discussing sex, sexual assault, violence, murder. But one thing that I respect a lot of Gifford is that I hope it's Gifford, by the way. It's not like Gifford or something. I
I
no
don't
way
think it
of.
is.
I hope very Gifford is going with that. But one thing that I really appreciate of him is that this is a pulp novel. It's a pulpy story. It's like lovers on the run. There's criminals and everything. But he knows what he has on his hands, but he manages to constantly insert political messages, social messages, cultural messages about a country that's getting more and more illiterate, and therefore the power of the written word. There's one character, we'll talk about him in a second, that's a writer in this, that's very prevalent. Um, it talks a lot about political uprisings going on in the world, political violence, revolts, um, what's happening in India, what's happening in Africa, what's happening, of course, in the States, what happened in the States. Um, you can tell that he's not just writing for kicks. He's not just in it for the thrill of it, to just show like being characters saying mean, awful things and just like being terrible to each other. He actually has something to say about the state of the world back in the late 80s. And this is also before there's things like the Tiananmen Square Revolution or the fall of the Berlin Wall. Like all of those things haven't happened yet, and it's such a an interesting snapshot in time. So I'm curious, how do you feel about the way he balances almost, just kind of like the pulpiness of it all. In a way, I don't know how you feel, but all of the moments of violence, of action, things that we'll see in the movie are not glorified, but take center stage whenever they happen. In here, they are like two lines in one chapter. They like come and go like that super quickly. So, how did you feel, Carson, about the way Gifford kind of like builds this world and inserts these themes?
I mean, I loved it. It's one of my favorite authors, and this is an author that is very, very aligned with what the writing here is Nathaniel West. I would love to do an
Mm.
episode like Day of the Locust, where it really transitions from these incredible acts of violence, sexual assault. Miss Lonely Hearts is a great example of that, and then transitions. Day of the Locust is also a great example of transitioning into a social commentary. As you mentioned, the chapters are very, very short here, which makes it extremely readable. And even if the commentary is just one or two lines, that still is a pretty substantial part of some of these chapters. I think it just feels incredibly smart and incredibly raw. It really is mixing like the ideals of like a Steinbeck and a Nathaniel West
Mm.
in a way that I feel like is super, super worthwhile. It is a book that you kind of have to. It builds over time. You can't just like jump in and just get the message from this. There's a lot here it's meditating on, and it's kind of hard to even claim like this is what the book is trying to say. This is the one
Mhm.
thing it's trying to reflect on. It is somewhat scattered thoughts, but that is where its identity as like a road trip book or a road trip story really, I think, works because you keep having these new characters, you keep having these new conversations, to where it's almost like if you were like traveling the country in a way and you're meeting all these random people from all these different places and everyone has their own unique little bit that they're able to talk about. I think it's incredibly well structured and well thought out and well written. Again, very dark, very, very dark. I think we should be really clear about that. Very violent, very sexual forward in a way that I think like a lot of people are not going to appreciate. I don't think Jack Luke Sharp would be a big fan of this book. But it still is one that like it never gets lost in that. It's never like the book becomes so disgusting that it has this giant maybe it's a weird example, but I think of like Rob Zombie's Halloween, where it's like
Mm.
that book that movie goes so disgusting in certain ways, especially with violence and sexual violence, that I'm like, I can't engage with the rest of this text because it has areas where it's just so revolting. This book didn't do that to me. I think it really balances it well. So no, I definitely appreciated it for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Was there any character that particularly resonated with you? Like it's a big cast. Some of the characters last maybe half a chapter occasionally, but is there one character that maybe you really liked following throughout?
I mean, there's so many good characters. Maybe it's gonna sound. I mean, this is like not necessarily someone they meet on the road, but I really love the character of the mother in this.
Mm.
Blanking on her name for
Marietta.
Marietta. Yes. Um, in the movie, she is this like backbone, and we'll get to the movie in a second. But here, she does get a little bit more fleshed out, and I think that also she presents such a great like oh, what's the word? Like a great there's a contradiction within her, right? Because she also is like she wants to be moral and she wants to be pure and she can't stand this guy who is taking her daughter off, but then also she is hiring people and trying to get them to kill him, and there's some great comedic bits there. But I think as a representation of America, she is one of the more fleshed out characters and one of the more holistically interesting characters for sure for me. I really like what they did here with her, and I think there's a lot of meaning and weight there, as well as just being, I guess, one of the more main characters, you would say.
Totally. And also she's very complex, also on like a moral level, which is very different from how she is in the movie. And one detail that, as you were mentioning as well, that I really liked rereading the book is how Lula, who's the daughter, in a couple of chapters, she acknowledges that she like maybe did something or said something that sounded like her mother, and how she is trying to run away from her literally, but also figuratively. As a person, she wants to be her own person, but she also can't deny that she's part of her, and she's almost bound to become like her. There is this little spark, this little inkling in it. Also, because we don't really learn that much about Marietta's past. But you can tell that she probably did do some things just like Lula did, and that's why she is against Sailor. She has met sailors in her past. I think even the choice of the name, honestly, to have a character whose first name is Sailor, it just tells you everything. Man of the world comes and goes. Is not there to stay, or maybe he is. Who knows? Um, my character that I really like, even the first time around, I really liked him. But even rereading the book, Johnny Farragut, and also
Of
by the
course.
way, just the names of these characters. Marietta Fortius, Sailor Ripley, Johnny Farragut, Marcelo Santos, Perdita Durago, Bobby Peru. It's like, oh my, this man. I ended up reading the second novel as well. And I was like, all the names that he comes up with, they are so good. It's so hard to have cool, memorable character names, and he has them constantly. But Johnny Farragut, who is, let's say, a private eye detective, friend of Marietta. She hires him, and he ends up following Sailor and Lula, trying to chase them, but at the same time, not really. He's like, these kids, they'll be fine. Let's just make the most of it. Let's enjoy the trip. And throughout the story, he just writes because he's a writer at heart. And so he just occasionally, gets an idea, he sees something, he's like, I need to write this down. Wait, I'm getting a story. And he just writes. And there's some of these chapters that are the stories that he's coming up with. And they are so bizarre, but also grounded in reality, grounded in memories from the past. Um, so much tenderness in them, despite some crude, crude dialogue, crude comments. That especially on this read, I was like, damn, like I want a Johnny Farragut collection of, of stories of poetry, whatever. And even the back and forth, like, they almost they work together in tandem. Marietta and Farragut, halfway through the book, they unite, and their back and forth are so delightful, and their relationship is so mature and genuine. Especially, there's the little jabs where she's like, "Well, I would like to read what you're writing." It's like, "No, no, 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 no. It's okay." Those little interactions that they have are so fun. And yeah, no, just Johnny Farragut. I love him. I love him a lot. But just in general, it is a surprisingly, despite all of the nastiness where this ends up into, despite the it's such an easy read, which sounds like a weird comment maybe, but I've gotten really back into reading recently. I think doing this podcast again has kind of kickstarted my brain being like, I want books, I need to read, I want to pick up things. And there are some novels or even like nonfiction books that I'm like, I'm struggling. Like, this is not very engaging. This takes a lot of mental energy, but not in the nice way, not in the good way, where you're just like, oh, I'm thinking about what I'm reading, but just like, what the hell are you trying to say here? And something like this is like, I don't know, it's just the equivalent of a cold beer on a warm summer day. Just like you kick back and it's like, feels so right, feels so perfect. Just the feeling of it. I don't know how it was for you, maybe even.
I
Um,
agree. I think though that you mentioned or kind of alluded to something a little bit deeper here, which is like, yes, again, very dark, a lot of sexual violence, and I like trying to take a space from that. And it sounds weird saying this in context of that, but like so much of this book is based on like real emotions of like love and real emotions of caring and connection. Um,
Humanity.
incredibly gross, yes, but like there is that core of humanity where these characters really care about either someone else or they care about themselves or they care about the story of this member. Like this book, for everything it is at its core, is about, I would say, love in every way. And I think that also helped. Like, yes, how it's written is obviously really great to get through. I just got done reading Native Son, and it's like there's no chapters and it's just constant text, and it
Oh
was like, oh,
God.
that was a brutal book to get through. So yes, coming into this is much brighter and nicer. But like undoubtedly though, I also think that it helps that on every level each character is human and has that complexity of humanity where yes, maybe there's some parts where that are unpleasant or gross or nasty and oily, but there's also that still human inside. In a book that is so negative, it's weird to be like, it is kind of like a nice. You said a cold beer on a hot day. It's almost like for me like a hot cup of coffee on a cold day, where it's like there's something
Hey,
a little bit warming here. There's something for me a little bit like I can keep coming back to, and it's really rewarding to read. I don't know if I would say it's like a positive. I don't know if I'm like come away from every chapter feeling like, oh, I'm so happy right now.
oof.
But there is something like warm about this book that I really appreciate, because it could be so easily just pure cold, pure trauma, pure violence. Um, but it never is just like purely that. Even as you mentioned with the mother, like there's a complexity, there's a maturity there that
She has
really
her own
helps.
love.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I would say it's a hopeful book. I think just inherently, just like from the get go, you have this manslaughterer coming out of prison, being met by this woman who has waited for him for almost 2 years. I think it's like 22 months or something. And you just see them trying to make the most of life, make the most of their love. It never feels cynical. It never feels fake. It always feels genuine. There are moments of doubt because it's unavoidable. There is a big pregnancy scare that turns true towards the end. But the way that they communicate, it's so unusual. We've talked also as well recently. I mean, we talked about queer. We've talked about we talked about Jane Eyre way back in the day on this podcast. We talked about a bunch of romance stories, and
50 Shades of
most
Grey.
Twilight. I mean, whoa. And almost all of them, exactly like case in point, like almost all of them rely on miscommunication, secrets, or repressing your emotions, not really truly saying how you feel. And I think that's what's so surprising about Sailor and Lula is that they're so open with each other. Like the simple fact, which reads weird, even when we go in the movie, you listen to it and it sounds weird, but the moment when he the moment you mentioned early on, where it was like she's talking about when she was assaulted by her uncle when she was little. The way like they're just talking about, sex and oh, you have the sweetest cock, those little comments that she's making. It's like, oh, I never felt like this. Oh, the first time I made it. And it was like, did you say the first time was when your uncle raped you or something? Which is just like bizarre in a way, but also it just shows you how comfortable they are with each other, that not only he already knows about this, but they've talked it through. He feels okay pointing it out, and she feels comfortable reliving in a way that memory. Again, it's very thorny territory, very thorny territory talking about these things. Um, but also, these are all larger than life characters. Despite Gifford managing to ground them in a way, making them feel believable. I think especially you can comment on this because it's so deeply American, right? Like it's like I'm watching it as a European and reading it as such. It's like all of this is alien, all of this is fiction, like out of this world, but it fits very well into the general image, the Americana that we mentioned earlier, right?
I mean, I think probably Lynch's film is a little bit more relatable in that sense. Like, the thing about this book that I think it's important to recognize is like, yes, this is about America and Americana, but it's specifically about an America of the past. I never lived in this
Mm.
America. So there is like this sense of nostalgia there, which I think like is a big hook also. And like you mentioned also, like, is there anything, and it's a narrative that we've seen from like the beginning of cinema and the beginning of stories, is there anything more romantic than like having a relationship and being like, let's run away together and let's go just hit the road? Like, no matter the context, no matter the situation, there's something insanely romantic about that idea. Same with nostalgia. Nostalgia is a fascinatingly romantic concept. Talking about a changing America, and this book talks a lot about a changing America, but very similar to Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie. I think that book and this book book is very similar in a way, where it's discussing a changing America and kind of previewing or having these conversations of an America of the future. But ultimately, as we read this concept, or as I guess specifically as me as an American, it is an America of the past. So we're kind of sandwiching this time in America with my lived experience and the projections of these books. So I wouldn't say I necessarily connect with this as like, that's me, that's America, woo, we
You
did it. But
don't feel seen in
undeniably,
this book?
yeah, I don't know if I fully, this is not my new Call Me by Your Name, but like, undoubtedly though, talking about the American image and the Americana image, I also think like it is impossible not to get fully political, but like there's a lot of conversation right now about what was America, when was America great, and looking at this era, I would say specifically as being like a great part of America, which is why it's really worthwhile. And again, going back to the mother character, to see kind of the like darkness and oiliness of this era, to really analyze that.
I'm trying to look up now. Who was the president? It wasn't Reagan still in the
No,
late
it was
80s,
after
was it?
Reagan.
It was during Reagan, actually. Right
Oh,
before Bush. Like 1989, Reagan went out. So it was fully in the 80s. Okay. And then George Bush came in. So interesting, interesting. So it's just this,
so middle of
this
like war on drugs, middle of like it's interesting, I guess, then because it doesn't read to me like Reagan politics at this time. I mean, I obviously I guess this is just a different angle because I think when you talk about
mm,
Reagan politics so much, you're talking about like communities of color, you're talking about drug usage, topics that maybe are
conservatism.
conservatism, which is like areas you can read into certain chunks here, but this is not the lens you typically give to that. So that's an interesting read I would have to consider.
Yeah, but one thing that I could maybe relate to from my experience, or just like the world's experience, one thing that I find interesting is that it can even be generalized more in a sense of just how we're running away from the past and the present, looking always for the future. That you have Marietta who represents the past. She's the old ways of living, but then as we were mentioning, there's parts of Marietta that are also very similar to how Lula is now. So it's like history repeating itself. The world is changing; it's getting worse. They hear news on the radio about like serial killers, murders. There's the crocodiles set free in the Ganges River in India to eat corpses. Like all of those very violent, terrible things happening. We will have massive protests where thousands of people lose their lives, being thwarted by governments. There's war in Europe, Balkans, um, and all of those things. They were present in the past, but since we don't remember the past or the past is long gone, it always looks better than the present. That's something we're seeing right now as well with what's happening in our world. It's a dark time. It's a very, very dark time. I've talked to some people who say it was way better 10 years ago, maybe 20, maybe 30, 40. And it's like, was it? Was it really? Because you look back, like I think that's one of the beauties of art, and one of the things we always talk about as well, even on Clappercast with some of the films you pick, is that there's always been problems, there's always been troubles. Maybe the language changes on how we talk about them. Maybe the scope of them changes, but they've always been present. And reading a book like this and thinking about the state of America, but also the world right now, it's like it's not that different. Some of those things that were happening back then are still happening now, actually, worse, honestly. Um, which makes it grim, but also, there's that hope. There's the hope of the two lovers. Like, you want them to succeed. It's such a simple trope, and that's why it works. Like, Gifford knows what he's doing with it, right?
Right, and actually to clarify, this was during George H.W. Bush's like first year in office. It wasn't Reagan, which makes more sense. I don't know a
There you
ton
go.
about. I'm not a historian on Bush, but I know he ran on more of like a civil liberty, like freedom, less control of the government, like messaging coming out of Reagan, which I think rubbed some people the wrong way, obviously.
Uh,
So it makes more sense that this book is looking at like this freedom and individualism compared to if it was during the early days of Reagan. So that adds up a little bit more.
Interesting. That's
But for
good to
sure,
know.
what you were saying, not to, not to completely ignore, like absolutely
No.
what you're saying about like these issues, and it's just a cycle, right? It's always a cycle. I mean, this is going to be, I imagine, in about 4 years, very relevant. The emotions of this book and this movie, um, we'll see.
Hopefully. And I think this is a good point to also transition into the movie. Um, so the story of how Wild at Heart, the film came to be, is very long, but just like very abridged Cliff Notes version. Um, Someone else was supposed to make the movie. Lynch read the script. He absolutely loved it. And he said, "This is actually going to be my movie now. Sorry, I'll make it." He had just finished wrapping up the first season of Twin Peaks. So it was hot stuff, you could say. The show hadn't aired yet. It hadn't aired yet. But people knew it was going to be probably big, at least the people who worked on it. So Lynch managed to get some funding and he got Wild at Heart, starring Nicolas Cage and Laura Dern, as well as a beautiful, beautiful cast of a lot of other familiar faces, including some Twin Peaks alumni that pop up in some side roles here and there. And the film was a success, kind of, at the Cannes Film Festival. It did win the Palme d'Or, the highest honors. It did receive some of the biggest, loudest boos ever at the award ceremony, which is incredibly hard to watch to this day. Um, but that's how festivals can be. And while it wasn't a big commercial success, it has garnered, like almost everything that Lynch has touched, a cult following. So Carson, what? How many times have you seen? By the way, was this the second time watching the film? Right?
Second time. Last May, I was watching Palme d'Or winners, so that's when I first checked this out.
Ah,
But this is my
nice.
rewatch. Yeah.
How was that experience then? How was it like watching it the first time and revisiting it for this
Okay.
podcast?
So the first time was like a revelation, like truly, and
Yes.
I love the book. This is so I love the book. It provides so much certain details that you can't get in the movie, but also like kind of take the book and throw it out the window. I think this is so much better than the book. But again, book is here. I think it's like it's both great, but the movie here is like it's truly like a revelation of like what Lynch can do. Like we talked a lot about Lynch. Obviously, we talked about multiple of his films on Clappercast, the Wrapped Reviews, and also our series. This is, I think, one of the best like combinations of everything Lynch is great at, all coming together to make kind of this perfect storm. Taking the core of the book, which is this road trip journey with two lovers going through America, meeting these different people on the run, and it just heightens every sense, like sense that you have. Visually, it's insane. The sound is insane. The smells and tastes, even though it's a film, are insane. It is just this visceral experience of Americana in a way that, like, truly is one of my favorite films maybe of all time. I will say in a rewatch, a little bit less impactful just because I knew what I was getting into, but still like a phenomenal film. How Lynch brings to life Americana, I think is so much more engaging in the film than it is in the book, just because naturally in the form of cinema, you can have so much more visuals from The Wizard of Oz. You can have Elvis
Right.
songs, you can have Elvis, you can have like all these little pieces of Americana, I think creating a super rich and engaging text. It isn't just characters, and I love how the book does dialogue and pushes dialogue to tell these different stories, but here you can get this sensual experience, to where I think it's Lynch's one of his best works. Like I love this film. So I guess for opening thoughts, like adored it.
Love it. Love to hear it. Because I also love this film. I've seen it 6 times now over the past few years. I remember the first time when we were studying Lynch. I don't think I told this story maybe on other podcast. Maybe I did. I don't remember. But long story short, um, doing my bachelor's, I was not studying cinema, but I did an extracurricular course on the history of cinema, which was very enlightening as a 19-year-old who loved movies. And one of the in the last part of the course, we were doing kind of like deep dives on 20 different directors, and my professor really loved David Lynch, and so she was talking about him. I ended up watching Blue Velvet, loved it, and looking at this filmography, I went, holy shit, there's a film with Nicolas Cage and Willem Dafoe, and I've not watched it, I've not heard of it. what's going on? I was just like, wild at heart it is. I'm watching it, and I was blown away by it. I was weeping by the end. It's like you said, it is like sensory overload, right? The first time you're watching it, because it's so unlike anything you've ever seen. Like, picture this for people, like if you're listening to this podcast, hopefully, we're spoiling everything. So you've seen this film, you've read the book even. Um, but just like opening scene of the film, like flames engulfing the screen, the titles are coming on, the beautiful score by Angelo Badalamenti sweeps in, and then Cape Fear, some time ago. There's Sailor, there's Lula. Who's this man? Bob Ray Lemon. Oh, Knife. Oh, boom. Hard rock. Just na na na. Head gets smashed in the floor, blood everywhere, and it's like, oh my god, we're only 2 minutes into this movie. What's gonna happen? it's such a, it's such a strong, such a memorable, such an impactful opening. It's insane. But one thing that also needs to be mentioned is that while I do love this movie, it is also, in my opinion, maybe David Lynch's messiest film because I, it is a very weird movie in the way that it was edited. You have Lynch making a first cut together with Mary Sweeney and realizing this is not working. So what they ended up doing was cutting a lot of scenes, like a lot of scenes, most of which are lost sadly. For some of his other films, they are available, but alas, for Wild at Heart, they are not. um they ended up changing the opening of the film. Like this first scene was supposed to be later on in the story when we have the flashback to Mariette in the bathroom. That's when we were supposed to see it, and instead they were like, you know what, let's just put this fucking death of Bob Ray Levin in the first 2 minutes of the film. It's crazy, and it just goes up from there. It feels weird. It's not, I would say it's almost like not a, it's made in a way that movies are not supposed to be made. Just structurally, just in terms of their writing. And I think because of that, or despite of that, I don't know, but it just works. It's as rebellious as the main characters are. It's just as free and wild and carefree, and it's intoxicating, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting that you mentioned how individual this feels in the terms of like how cinema is produced and put together because it absolutely does feel that way. But when you boil it down, this is a narrative that is like very in line not just with what Lynch has done as far as like really when you boil this down, it is a story of a man growing up, finding his path forward for happiness, starting with fully being consumed with individualism, discovering love, having faith in love. But it's also like just mirrors like the Wizard of Oz in a lot of ways. Like, it obviously has some very references, very clear references to the Wizard of Oz. But really, when you look at it, the journey of this character could be one of the characters in the Wizard of Oz going and finding out that what he needs is right there in front of him and it's not actually something that has to fix himself. Like it is wild how this movie at the same exact time, and it's not like there's two like distinct sides to this film where one side is one thing, one side is the other. The same project is both a very incredibly basic narrative in terms of cinema, but also feels absolutely batshit insane and like a complete mess. And it walks those lines so well together. I think this character of Sailor and what he does in this film and really hitting the nail on the head here, especially with again the American iconography, I think is one of the more effective and more moving character evolutions in any Lynch project, I would say. Like I really this is my second favorite Lynch film behind Blue Velvet, which has another story of a man coming to terms and finding out about the world around him and changing how he views the world. This evolution, I would say, is probably even a little bit more engaging for me than that. Like, this really is a great character, and it's all fueled, again, just like the book, by love and the trust of love and how you can feel like you need to be so much more. You can feel like you need to have all this individualism and all this freedom. Um, but sometimes that love in front of you and that love is what you should focus on and find fulfillment in. It's a really captivating story, but it's interesting to me how you can say this movie is built wildly and the structure's weird and it feels like this shouldn't be how a movie's made. It's incredibly messy, but at the same time, it has such a clear through line and it's so rewarding. I guess this is kind of almost echoing some of the statements I made during the Lynch marathon with like Blue Velvet, Lost
Mhm.
Highway, where he's just a master. I think that's something where I don't know if a lot of people talk about that with Lynch. I think with Lynch, a lot of people are just like, oh, he's so weird. Um, he is weird. Undoubtedly, his films are strange and bizarre, but they're always so focused and so competent in their through line and the messaging they're trying to get through and with their characters' evolutions. It's a balance that like very few filmmakers have. I think this is like probably one of the best examples of those two identities of Lynch working together to create something really poignant.
He's an inherently emotional filmmaker. That's something I have always loved about him. You're spot on. Like, I'm going into his filmography, I always only heard about the weirdness, realism, yada yada. But what surprised me first with Blue Velvet, then watching all of the rest of his works, is that they are so emotion driven. If that should always be the guiding light. We talked about it in the very very good conversation that we had with Jack Luke and Ivan on Inland Empire, which is the most opaque and even obtuse, you could say, Lynch work. The emotions are your guiding light in his films. If you don't know what to think, it's just like follow your heart. And while that heart has its core message, just like if you believe in something, in someone, if those feelings are true, just follow them and they will lead you to good places. It Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just saying, like, yeah, like you really just, I mean, and maybe this is not really the best advice in life, specifically with like relationships. Maybe use a little bit more brain than just heart, but like, this is a movie that challenges you to just like turn off your brain in a sense because there's all these red flags obviously with this relationship, but just like feel the connection. You inherently, again, maybe it's because the setup is so romantic, but you inherently like this relationship. I would say in the movie you like these characters, and it just tells you to like, if you trust your heart and just support what you're feeling, then you're going to get a really rewarding experience, and by the end that comes true. Again, there are many nuances to real life relationships that are not movie scripts, but it is wild how this movie, like, if you just fully trust your heart, you're going to get the most rewarding and satisfying experience, and like you're going to be fully paid off in this movie. If you use your brain similar to the mother, you're probably going to be a little frustrated and probably be a little bit like, what, why are they doing this? But then you're going to be proven wrong. So it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what works about all of the Wizard of Oz references, which are overt, like you mentioned. Lynch does not shy away from them, but they work because not only is he a massive fan of Wizard of Oz, but also of It's a Wonderful Life, his two favorite movies, which are also movies driven by emotions, not so much by logic. Um, but he, instead of using that to make the characters feel childish, because that's something with Lula especially. Lula is the one who's constantly talking about the Wizard of Oz. She's wearing the red shoes. She sees her mother as the literal wicked witch of the West. Um, but it's a sign of purity in a way. And at least that's how I see it, because the world that these characters live in is brutal, obscene, even loud, chaotic, maddening. And the only thing that makes sense is their love for each other. It's the only thing that's grounding them in a way. It's the only thing that's making them move forward, even literally in this case. So to have these references to the Wizard of Oz, a story that's so much a part of people's childhoods. Like, I know very few people who have not seen it as a kid. I think it's one of those movies that almost everyone has seen on at least like planet Earth, like English speaking Western countries. Um, and it's such a beautiful story of magic, of what you were saying, of finding yourself, like of finding your own truth in yourself, basically. And so to have her be this obsessed with the story, it's not so much the first time around when I watched it, I saw her as more childish. I saw her in a worse light, I would say. It's almost like, oh, she's a kid and she's trying to run away. But then revisiting it over the years, it feels like it's what we all need in a way to cope with the world we live in. We need art. We need something that we see ourselves in, that speaks to us, that helps us see the world through a different lens. And through that lens, we can cope with what's happening. Um, one of the most shocking sequences in the entire film. It just tense. Like every time I watch this movie, the sequence when Bobby Peru goes to visit Lula in her bedroom, which is not in the book. It's disturbing. It's scary. You are just waiting for an assault, for violence to happen. But the moment when he just like bounces out, he turns it into a joke. He runs away, and she's just left there, full of shame, full of fear. What does she do? She clicks her red little slippers. She's trying to get back home. She's doing what Dorothy does. Does it work? Not really, but it feels like that sort of, coping mechanism. That's what she's clinging on to. That's probably what kept her going through the assault of the uncle, the
Yeah.
evil mother that she has, the death of the father, all those things.
Which what a great look, and this entire film is really at the complexity of like the American dream, specifically in culture and like American society and how it's built upon itself. I might write an article eventually because I think people do not also talk about how Lynch is like the most American filmmaker ever made, like ever to exist. Every single one of his films is just so like baked with like a conversation on America, and he himself is like surrounded, obsessed with Americana. He goes to Bob's Burgers. That's like what he's, or whatever it's called, Bob's Big Burgers. I don't know what it's called. That's like a core American staple. He has all these woodpeckers that he saved. Like he is surrounded
Yes.
by Americana. Every one of his films, from Blue Velvet on, is like an Eraserhead. Even is like talking about the American condition. But it's super interesting when you look at Wizard of Oz and Elvis. Also, I think both of those are great examples of like those are such safe core pieces of like the American lore in culture. But when you look at both of those examples, they're both really like texts or characters about like a certain revolution or a certain like rejecting the past and changing. Dorothy literally is surrounded in this black and white world, and then she leaves and goes to this world of color, and she leaves the old world behind. Elvis is like this bad boy who's in Jailhouse Rock, and he's such a bad guy, but ultimately they're both like then like digested by the American society of like the 50s through 90s, let's say, and still very relevant, obviously. Um, but then they're both like these sources of power, but then there's also this contradiction of these texts are about these revolutionary ideas and breaking the mold, but you also then have like that digested by the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, which are like very restrictive times socially, so there's a contradiction there. It's a source of power for her, but obviously that doesn't quite in your example work out. But it's an interesting look, this entire film is, I think, at the contradiction of like the American dream and the Americana lore that is built. And again, that's Lynch in everything, whether he's looking at the suburbs and Blue Velvet, whether that is in Lost Highway, even Inland Empire. Like Lynch is obsessed with America in every single one of his texts. And I think this is like such a large scale example of it. Shout out to the documentary Lynch/Oz. If you're a big
Yes.
Lynch fan, please go check it out because it's like half good and half really campy and terrible. I love that it's like every essay, because it's like a collection of video essays basically, is like really trying to dig in deep of like, why is it all Wizard of Oz? And then they get to talking at Wild at Heart, which is like explicitly Wizard of Oz, and they still have to present it as if it's like a nuanced thing. They're like, did you notice that the Wicked Witch is in it? It's like, no shit. But like I think the statement there is good about like Lynch has always been about Americana, and this is probably his most direct, but also most nuanced look at like the power that gives. Even with the mother trying to stop this individualism, and Sailor is basically Elvis at points. There's a warring identity there, and it's also again weird coming from like people our ages, and I guess specifically me. I don't know if you in Italy have the same experience, but like I associate Elvis with like my grandpa. I'm like, oh, my grandpa like probably had a picture of Elvis on his wall next to like John Wayne. And I'm sure my like grandma
Oh
like
god.
loved Wizard of Oz. She had like a cookie tin probably with like Wizard of Oz on it. Like for me, that is such an old school idea. But also the themes of those texts I would never associate with my grandparents. So it's this weird contradiction of like, um, who what are you getting from like what is Americana? What is it actually saying? What's the actual message? Similar now where like I think with conservative politics you have all this like love for rock and roll and this like rebellion, but it's like ultimately what you're standing on is trying to restrict that rebellion and destroy individualism. So it's like there's all this contradiction in the American dream and the American soul. And I think this film is like brilliant in how it looks at that.
Yeah, yeah, and I would say it also goes to the credit of the book, of the source material, that Lynch managed to read that, and the story was being passed around, and he saw the potential for something there to actually write his own script and make it his, with still some support of Barry Gifford. They ended up becoming friends. Barry Gifford co-wrote Lost Highway with him, which is terrific, honestly. And you can see that, right? Like the moment I read the book and then I revisited Lost Highway in the future, I was like, oh yeah, I can see Barry Gifford actually. And something that we haven't mentioned yet, which is crazy, but so much of the dialogue in the film is straight out of the book. We're talking quotes, direct quotes, constantly through the entire film.
I forgot when she discussed her rape was in the movie when I was reading it because I read the book before I rewatched the movie. So I forgot it was literally like line for line. I was like horrified watching it on the book. I was like, wait, this is in this? This is insane.
It feels like reading the screenplay, right? Occasionally, you're just going through it scene by scene. Um,
Well, and also how much love do you have to give to like Nicolas Cage and to Laura Dern and to even like Willem Dafoe in his supporting role? Like this cast, and I don't know how much truth there is, but like the story goes, Lynch was reading the book and was like, "Oh my God, this is Nicolas Cage. Oh my God, this is Laura Dern," and just saw these actors within their characters. But like, yeah, even reading the book, and again, I do not have the context of reading the book without seeing the movie first, but like these are like the embodiment of these characters. Like there's no actors who or no cast of characters that could be connected as well, I feel like, than these. Like it's perfect. Nicolas Cage is perfect. Laura Dern is perfect. Willem Dafoe is perfect. Everyone here is like perfect at bringing this story to life in a way that like if they did not understand the assignment so well, which I think speaks to Lynch in every single one of his works, it would not be this successful.
we also have to mention the stunt casting, if we will consider that, of having Diane Ladd as Lula's mother, who's actually Laura Dern's mother. you know, um, um, just in such a committed performance. Oscar nominated as well, which good for her, deservedly so. There's that moment when she is just absolutely losing her mind that her daughter has left her. She's calling Johnny Farragut, and then she's calling Marcelo Santos, this criminal that she wants to hire to save Lula and kill Sailor. And she's just like painting herself. I don't even know how to describe it. She's just covering herself with red lipstick, almost having this bleeding face of sorts. And I love those horror movie strings that Badalamenti uses to undercut some of those moments, some of those revelations. The last time I watched the movie was a little over a month ago in the cinema with a crowd, and so many of the people there hadn't seen it, and it was just so much fun to witness all those reactions to these crazy moments. It did also make me realize that this is one of the most genuinely funny films that Lynch has made. The humor is constant throughout. But yeah, golden cast, golden cast.
Also, got to mention, I definitely means more to you than it means to me, but still, Cheryl Lee in this is like what casting? What beautiful kind of poetic casting for that.
The Good Witch. Oh man, it's amazing. We'll get to the ending. We'll get to the ending. Um, One character, and this is a problem that I have with the movie because we are talking primarily about book versus film. There's one thing that I don't like about the film. It felt wrong the first time watching it, and now having read the book twice, it feels even worse. But what they do to poor Johnny Farragut, like, oh my god. First of all, Harry Dean Stanton, one of my all-time favorites. Love him. I gave him my award for like best performance in Twin Peaks: The Return, in a Lynch film. Probably should have been Cheryl Lee, for Fire Walk with Me, but it deserves more love. Okay, but in this film is delightful. Is so lovable as this weirdo detective, fully in love with Marietta, doing everything she tells him to do. There's the first scene when he's introduced where they're just playing peekaboo with each other. And the face that he makes is just giggling like a little kid. It's so wholesome. It's so beautiful. Then why? Why do they have him have the worst fate out of everyone in this movie? He gets abducted, tortured, made feel like an absolute wet, like used towel of Marietta right before he gets killed. There is a deleted scene that, thank God, they removed. Did you read about this? Um, this death scene of Johnny Farragut was extended, where basically after they shoot him, the couple Reggie and Perdita's sister, played by Grace Zabriskie, also Twin Peaks, they start having sex on the corpse. And when they had press preview screenings, it was literally the moment where everyone started leaving the screen. They were like, we're not doing this. We're not doing this." It feels like something that would have been in the book, but it's actually not. Like Johnny Farragut lives through the entire book. In here, they do something that I don't. I mean, I hate saying it because it's become kind of like the thing, but it's almost like a John Wick type of world of the mob where they have their gold rings to use to call the hit on someone. Right? It's the same thing. It's just, it's just making it's using old mythology, what you used to do with Charon, the bringer of the dead, put the little eyes, call whatever, it's fine. Um but the way they just build up this criminal underworld, which is very cartoonish, in a good way though, very fun. Barcelo Santos becomes a key character, a key player in here, who ends up having Johnny Farragut killed. And I don't know how you feel about this whole thing because it's just very personal to me. Okay, I love Johnny. I love Johnny. I love Harry Dean. And so every time it gets to that scene, which in a way it's great because it makes it more impactful. I was like, this poor guy, he really does not deserve this. How do you feel about this whole thing?
I mean, he's definitely your character, so I appreciate that
He's
from the
my
book that you have
characters.
this connection. It definitely is like a weird fate, but for me, like now that we're talking about it, it's definitely odd. I don't know if it necessarily bothered me. I mean, I'm happy they removed that scene. Hearing what that scene was gonna be, and I had no
Yes.
idea about it, that definitely would have bothered me. So I think that was a strong move. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, and this character also, like, I think he has a lot more soul in the book. Not that he isn't soulful in the movie, but he is played more, I think, as a comedic character a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it didn't necessarily bother me, but like, um, I think that restraint was helpful because I feel like if they would have included that scene, I'd probably be on here saying it went a little far.
Yes, yes. And in a way, I'm glad it's not available. I would have seen it if it were, but thankfully, I think there's maybe one still from a work print, some nonsense like that. But yeah, there's plenty of other scenes that were deleted. I can imagine maybe some of the interactions, some of the characters from the book that are missing in here. They replace them in a way that I appreciate. I do love in the novel. There's this weird little hitchhiker that they pick up. This weird crazy kid. That's just
Do you wish it all there was, and I'm sure the answer is going to be probably yes, but like, do you wish there was like a 4 hour version of this out there that just had like everything, or do you like that it's cleaned up? Like, do you want that more here?
Not really, to be
Okay.
honest. I mean, it's a movie that's walking such a tightrope, and that's what people hated in Cannes. It's like, the tightrope. They fell. They were walking like, "Ah, I'm not standing on this, Lynch. I'm not standing on it. I'm standing on it, strong, confident. I love it, but it could so easily fall apart. I think all of the changes that Mary Sweeney did in the edit, and this was her first like proper collaboration with Lynch as an editor. She worked on like an assistant editor, something on Blue Velvet, but she really helped clean this up and salvage it. because there's so many like stories. There's the whole cousin Dell part where he dresses as Santa Claus and cockroaches in his pants and whatever. There's so many constant like cutting back and forth, which are also part of the book. It's those anecdotes and funny memories and characters that they talk about. But I think I don't know, even like 10 more minutes of this movie, if they're put in the wrong place, even just like one more minute of the death of Johnny Farragut could make this collapse. But no, as it is, I'm happy with. I wish there was a way of seeing the footage just as a experience, similarly to Blue Velvet. You remember we talked
Well,
about it. I'm glad we
yeah.
have the 1 hour of lost footage. There's a reason why it's lost footage for the most part.
Is the original cut that was at, because he debuted at Cannes and then it had to get cut down before the US release, but foreignly it was released with a Cannes cut. Is that like out there? Do we
Maybe
know?
I take this with a grain of salt. The only real difference is with violence. They
Yeah.
they like hid the violence. Maybe you read about it, right?
Yeah, they lowered the
But
I
for
mean, that was the big issue because it was going to be X if not. So, but I assume you're like the Lynch. I assume if you turn the camera around, you have like just reels of like Lynch, like things you've dug up. Is
I
the
have a
more
little like
violent?
shelf.
Yeah, yeah.
The back
But
of-
if you pull the book out and it, like the bookcase opens and then behind it is like your Lynch historian like museum, is the foreign cut like is that out there?
it is, but it's basically the same
Yeah,
movie. Only that I want to say the only real difference is during the death of Willem Dafoe, where
yeah.
his character Bobby Peru he gets shot by the police, by one cop actually, and he just accidentally blasts himself in the head with a sawed-off shotgun that just splatters it all over a wall. In the US cut, they digitally added smoke to kind of like cover it up. In the other version, it's very clear as day. There's no smoke covering it up. I think it's just as nasty. I don't see how the smoke changes anything. It's like, no, 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 but it's fine. In that case, R rating is okay. Otherwise, NC-17. Don't have the smoke, NC-17. I don't know. It's just MPAA is bizarre. Um, but yeah, it's just like that's the primary change. Otherwise, it's basically the same theme. I don't think there's any like narrative cut or even like
No, it's
shorter
minor.
sequence. Yeah, 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 yeah. No, but it's I mean, it's minor changes in that cut, as well as it's like minor changes in the narrative. There's very few outside of Johnny Farragut's death, and so having this hit put on Sailor. That element is completely absent, basically, from the book. But here, they turn Marietta into a straight up villain who wants to protect her daughter. She is the evil witch of the West. Um, they do have this element where Sailor was also involved in the criminal underworld. Like he was the driver of the people who actually killed Lula's father, and he witnessed that. It does get maybe a bit too convoluted in that sense, but it also leads to having the climax, where Bobby Peru is actually in on this thing. Perdita Durango is someone who is dating Bobby Peru, and she's also in on this thing, and they're trying to kill Sailor to get cash to go live their own little happy life. So it makes it more cinematic, right? Which is always such a weird term. What is cinematic? But you're reading the book, you just accept that these things are happening, you're just going along with the narrative, especially because it's so episodic. But in the film, you need some kind of through line. So to have that tension of, the killers are after Sailor. And there's even that cut because one time, like one of the evil men is calling this one house. I don't know. We don't know who's inside. And then when Sailor actually goes there, there's like this musical string again. It's like, oh my god, oh my god, it's the same house. No, Sailor, go away. That's not a safe place. It has this playful element to it that I appreciate. But for the most part, it does play out in the same way as the book does, right?
Overall,
Except,
oh, go for it.
except for the ending, very different, very very different, but also very relevant. So, how do you feel, first of all, with the book, the ending of the book? Sailor goes to jail. He has to stay there for like 10 years, like a lot of years, longer in the book than it does in the film. But Lula was with child. She decides to keep the child. Marietta is okay with that in the end. They call him Pace, little Pace, Pace Fortune Sailor Ripley. Um, and she decides to still be loyal to Sailor after all those years. She's gonna wait for him, and she does. She goes to pick him up after he's left jail with their son. But he decides it's like, kid doesn't really know me. This is just weird. I can see you're a bit emotional and upset over this. I can just go and live in my own life. You go and live in yours. And he just leaves. I mean, it's hard to separate it from the ending of the film, I know, but how was it for you reading it the first time? Did you even expect this was going to happen? Did it take you by surprise? That's how the novel ends, with Sailor
Yeah.
departing.
I mean, I definitely didn't expect it just because I knew what the movie ending was gonna be, so I was waiting for that little bit more. Um, it's a strange conversation to have because, like, in the context of the book, I was not particularly bothered by this ending. I think it works for the book. Had it been in the movie, I would have been more pissed off. But I think it is obviously tragic, but I think it also is kind of speaking to what the book is going for more. Like, there is supposed to be tragedy here. There's supposed to be consequence with this relationship. Don't fall in love with the sailor because then you get again with more of the mother, and it's a cycle. How did the mother
Mhm.
become who she is? Because of people like Sailor. Um, I think the ending of the movie works much better for what Lynch is going for with this. But I wasn't particularly bothered by the book, but it was surprising because again, I was just expecting the movie ending, and there is that final chunk missing.
Yeah, yeah, but like you were saying, it works. I think also because the these characters have a more, and I say it in not the way we would usually use the word, but the relationship in the book is more complex than it is in the movie. In the movie, it is played as this swooning, just straight up. These two people love each other with the capital L, and that's kind of it. The only real problems they have are of the economic variety, as they say in the stories. Um, at the end, and the child is coming, but they're just it's just the realities of living in the world that are starting to
Yeah.
with the problems in the relationship, also the bad influence of the evil witchy mother. But in the book, throughout it, there's always this constant of Lula being a bit more, I don't want to say mature, but she's taking things a little bit more seriously than Sailor is, just
Yeah.
life and what's happening in the world, right?
Well, and Sailor, like, not to keep going back to this scene, but like, there is a big difference that you mentioned. Well, I mentioned, but then you mentioned in the movie how that scene where she's talking about her rape, like, is played as this like connection moment and this vulnerability between these characters out of love. In the book, it is very much so from Sailor's point of view, like exploitative almost, where he's getting turned on by her
It's just
suffering, her pain. Like,
crazy.
the
Like, God.
relationship is very different in the both. Where in the book, yes, again, there's still that underbelly of love, and still this like romanticism of this journey. But it's not necessarily like these characters are like both these broken, wild at heart characters that find themselves and are super healthy, to where like I don't necessarily feel bad that they lose each other in the end, because ultimately this does feel in the book like it's justified as being the best outcome for her and her child. The sailor is not the same. Um, Innocence doesn't have the same innocence in a way, I guess maybe a weird word to describe him in the movie, but like he doesn't have that sense of like heroism in the book. You never really stand Sailor in the book. He always has that little bit of like that darkness where like, yo, you're just a slimy kind of asshole. Like you don't you're not that character.
Yeah. It doesn't have the snakeskin jacket. That makes a difference. Makes a big, big difference.
Yeah.
Um, but the ending of the film, oh my god, the ending of the film. Sailor, it's basically everything that happens in the book, only that Sailor leaves. He gets surrounded by a bunch of men. He calls them gay. They punch him in the face. And in these days, he gets visited by Glinda the Good Witch, as we mentioned. And she tells him, don't run away from love, sailor. Don't run away from love, sailor. Don't run away from love. Gentlemen, I apologize for calling you homosexuals. He just sees the light. He sees the light. And he's like, what am I doing? This woman waited for me for like 7 years. I have a kid. She's ready for this. It's gonna be a bit hard. It's gonna be a bit weird. No, it will take time. But she's willing to work it through. She stood by me through all of this. Second time going to jail, she's still here for me. What am I doing? And the moment I've seen this movie 6 times, Carson, the moment he just screams her name and runs away, the Badalamenti score just like zoom, swells. I just get so emotional. It's like, oh my god, this is the evil witch starts melting, you know?
I mean, it's
She throws the
beautiful. You
glove.
have to like sit up. If I saw this in the cinema, I imagine I would have to stand up and like cheer them on as I'm crying. Like it's a beautifully poetic romantic ending. And I think like I've seen some reviews where they're like the scene with the men where they beat him up is really strange, and why is that there? I think it's so important to also like so many of us in moments in our lives get this really clear like image stuck in our head of like this is who we are, this is the life we want to live, but Sailor needs to be lying there on the ground and suffering to be like, wait, this doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel to be alone getting in these fights, like going back to the power of love and the emotions of love. Like, again, very clear differences, I think, in the character of Sailor that make this moment feel justified. But it is one of the more romantic endings. And again, like if you've been following the story, engaging it with your heart, and you're like, wait, I love these two together though. They found each other and that's powerful. What a rewarding, satisfying conclusion that no, he is gonna go back to her. He is gonna rise to the occasion. He is gonna be that guy. It's beautiful. It's very, very positive. I would say in the history of like romance on film, maybe one of the more like powerful like endings where it's like, oh, that was good. That got me.
You see it throughout. There's so many moments that are just not present in the book. Where Lynch injects even the way he frames the sex scenes, with those colors kind of like blurring all the intimate moments. It's the red, it's the yellow, it's the green. It's gorgeous. It's gorgeous, and just this moment, which ties into the whole Elvis persona that Nick Cage has always loved. They play into that with the film. The snakeskin jacket, the look is just Elvis. He sings "Love Me" earlier in the film, and she asks him, and that's always like the first time I watched it. The first time I watched it, I was like so happy because she asked me, I was like, "Why didn't you sing me Love Me Tender, Sailor?" He's like, "Oh, well, I said I'll only sing it to my wife." Or it's gets to the ending. Sailor is running on top of these cars, just heavy traffic. He finds Lula, and that's all they say to each other. It's like, Sailor, Lula, Sailor, Lula. It's just like, oh my god, it's just like living rent free. And what does he do, Carson? He sings Love Me Tender. And it's the end credits, which is just like you just want to scream. It's just like this is perfect. Those are my there's I love the Inland Empire credits with Cinnamon. We talked about it, but the end credits of Wild at Heart are probably my favorite end credits of all time. I just like I live in that moment. I love that moment so much, and it's beautiful. And Nick Cage can sing.
Yes, he
It's not great.
can.
But he can sing. He can do Elvis. He really can do Elvis. You're a big fan of what's his face?
Austin Butler?
Dog it. No,
Oh
Dog
no,
It
no,
Dog.
sure. Yes.
Where he also plays Elvis, basically, right? Was that the
He has a
one?
history of playing Elvis, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Um, I mean, as you said, it's like perfect. And again, like not to rehash the same point, but like Nicolas Cage and Laura Dern, oh my god, like them in each other's looking at each other's eyes, like sharing that moment. It's beautiful. I love the idea that someone who saw this in the theater, probably a lot of people, didn't register what that song meant on the first viewing, and they were like, "Why is this the ending? Why are they singing the song randomly?" But it is like one of the great payoffs, I think, in like cinema, right? Like, it's interesting because I think this film, and we talked about how I think Lynch previously is like. It's strange because everyone loves Lynch and like adores him, right? I think we saw the outcry of support when he unfortunately passed, but at the same
Mm.
time, I think so much of his work is overlooked and not valued. Like I look at this ending. Whether it's the song, whether it's like it just I guess every aspect you can look at with this ending, and really this film overall, and I'm like, this is one of the greatest romances in the history of cinema, but I almost guarantee you would never find this on that list. The ending moment, the payoff of that song into those end credits, one of the best. You mentioned end credits probably in the history of cinema. You would never find this on that list. Like it feels so strange to me that like this is such a masterclass in like Lynch and what he can provide to cinema and just how excellent he can be alongside the rest of his filmography. But it feels like nobody talks about this or talks about how perfect it is. Similar to a lot of his other films, like we mentioned, but it's such a strange like contradiction again, and maybe this entire film and David Lynch is just a bunch of contradictions. But it's strange how everyone worships at the altar of Lynch, but like nobody talks about Wild at Heart. No one talks about so much of his films, even like Straight Story, and there's so much where like people might culturally be like, oh, that's a good movie, but they don't really talk about it. I think you look at this film and it's like in so many ways, probably like some of the best, at least one of the best romance films ever made, I guess. Let's just say that. But it's remarkable. And like the ending, it's so satisfying on such a complete level. Like there's no sense of like oh, this is missing, or this ended a little too quickly, or this went a little long. It just like it fills your heart in a way that like, oh, I wish I could see this in a cinema. I'm so jealous that you got to see this in a cinema, because I imagine just sitting there and letting it wash over you must have been just like magic.
Uh, yes, but it was weird. I have to say, generally speaking, I've always had positive experiences going to the cinema. And I used to read it on Twitter, now Blue Sky, of people, or like in the States, most of the times. If not the States, it's the UK. They're like, I went to this repertory screening and people were laughing throughout and people weren't liking this and that. I never experienced it up until I went to watch both Blue Velvet and and Wild at Heart in the cinema. For those two, I watched other Lynch films as well during January and February, but they went well. No one was laughing during Inland Empire, trust me. Many people were sleeping at 11 p.m. But with Blue Velvet, it was rough, man. People were laughing during the Robbins monologue. Laura Dern was like, "What the fuck?" Some were laughing when like some people like next to me when Dorothy Valance comes out of the darkness completely naked and beat up, and they were just looking at each other like, "What the fuck's happening?" I was like, "What do you mean? Are just that's what?" Just like leaving the screens baffled. And I think what helped with him Wild at Heart is that it is an inherently more funny film by design. Got some big laughs. I just hate that Nicolas Cage is a meme. I finally experienced it twice because I also watched The Surfer in the cinema, and that was like I started to piss me off. This poor man can't open his goddamn mouth without people laughing. It's like not everything he's saying is a joke. Not it's not all funny. It's not some parts are funny. When she tells him she's pregnant and he just lights up two cigarettes, it's a funny beat. There's some very funny beats, but not everything is funny. And so I could tell because I was with Full House. I could tell that barely anyone in my area, at least, left the screening emotional. Some of them bolted. Credits started to roll. They're like, "Movie's over. Bye. I'm done." It's like, no, the song. Let's stay for the song. What are you doing? It was so bizarre. It was so bizarre. I don't want to make excessive statements or like be a bit hyperbolic. I do that occasionally from time to time. But witnessing this after the death of Lynch did feel very, very bad. Made me lose a little bit of hope for the future of movie going audiences. Where two movies that are so genuine and earnest are received by first time viewers, because those are 100% the reactions of first time viewers. They are received by confusion, bafflement, and derision, being like, but this was weird. It was a bit cheesy. That's something I heard out of Blue Velvet. That movie was a bit cheesy. It's like, what do you mean cheesy? What do you mean cheesy? The Robin at the end, the mechanical Robin? Okay, fine. I was like, I don't know, man. It made me which now this is becoming my own Wizard of Oz. Like I put this back in like 2019. I think I put it in a top 10 favorite comfort films. Wild at Heart in its own sick way is a comfort movie for me now. Um, and I think I just want to stay in that comfort. I don't want to go in the real world where people are laughing in front of David Lynch films and not feeling emotions.
That's just shocking. Like, I don't know how that could be reaction though. Like, Nicolas Cage, like, I we would be here all day with me ranting about how he has been received by the public and used by Hollywood recently.
Yeah.
There's nothing more shocking than like in a pretty quick. I think last year over the course of the year, like I watched this Dog Eat Dog, like a lot of great Nicolas Cage performances, and it's like the only like Lynch and Schrader. Funny enough, are like I think the two people who really have a clear vision on like how to use. I mean, he did a lot of great stuff in like the 90s and early on, but like Schrader, I guess more modernly, is the only one who understands how to like use Nicolas Cage and why Nicolas Cage is a great actor. And seeing him like in every role just clearly hired now because they're like, what's the meme, Nicolas Cage? And he can do his best, but like even the film, not even just the audience, but the films themselves, whether it's Dream Scenario, whether it's Long Legs,
The
and
Surfer coming up soon, which
I
I've
haven't,
already seen. 100% the same thing.
yeah.
100%.
It's just like it's depressing to see someone who's like could be and is often like a masterful performer even in these roles, but just clearly no one, whether it's behind the camera or at in the cinema watching, has any interest in engaging with him on that level. No, but that is that's sad to hear, specifically about Blue Velvet. Like you mentioned, like this is campy. It's I get like at the ending she comes down in a bubble. Like I get it. It's funny. It's campy, but like very tragic anti-art takes, I guess, about Blue Velvet, but alas.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. People did like Inland Empire, though, I can say that.
Hey, that's
The ones
good.
who stuck around for the corrections. I was like, why is this is the only screening of Lynch that's not sold out? Shocking. No one wants to see 3 hours of Inland Empire on a weekday at night. Um,
So I guess like I don't know, I guess then like not to go off track here with Wild at Heart, but like as the legacy of Lynch continues to obviously evolve and develop over the years, like how do you think that David Lynch, but maybe even specifically going into like Wild at Heart, how do you think this film is going to be ultimately contextualized in his filmography? Do you think this is going to be seen as like a hidden gem that needs analyzed? Do you think that people are going to look at this and be like, that was kind of the weird, funny one he made? Like, how do you think this is going to grow as more and more people, I think, obviously due to his passing, is going to go through his filmography and I think really create a narrative of some of these films?
I think it will remain a minor work, which kind of hurts a little bit. But I can see that as well. I'm not too upset about it. Um, I think the people who love it, like us, really love it, and we can be very vocal about it, about our love for Wild at Heart. But I can also see why most of his other movies. I would say honestly, like if I were to say, I would probably say that maybe Inland Empire is for the weirdos. It's for the people who love like pure experimental cinema, so they are just already a niche, very loud but still a niche audience. And Dune, you have to be just weird to say Dune is one of your favorite Lynch films. Honestly, it's
Me.
fine. I like it.
It's
We like
me.
it. We do like it a lot, but I wouldn't put it in. It's in my top 10.
Well, sure.
It's in my top 10 Lynch films. But I
Not
do like
mine.
it. Um, but compared to something like it doesn't have the complexity, we could say, even though I hate the term, but let's say the complexity of Mulholland Drive and Lost Highway. It doesn't have the simplicity of Blue Velvet. It doesn't have the emotions of Elephant Man and Straight Story, or even Fire Walk with Me, which ties into just Twin Peaks as a whole. Um, it's not like those movies. I would
Yeah.
say it is mess. Like you watch it and it feels weird in the way that these others just don't, in the way it's put together. It's like, what's happening? It's like it's constant it's constantly cutting to these flames, constantly cutting to characters come and go left and right, which funnily enough, that's how the book is. But it was supposed to be played in a more straightforward way, which makes it even funnier that they ended up recutting it in this bizarre way that actually makes it more special and more worthwhile. I think this would be, honestly, only time will tell what's going to happen. I think Lynch just like his legend at this point will make the film be discovered by more people and hopefully liked by more people. I think just the Nick Cage connection, despite everything that we talked about, does hook people a lot. It is one of my top three favorite performances from him. Um, just like so many, just man, like he starts singing "Love Me," and in the actual soundtrack, they repeat the shrieks of the girls in the audience. It's just so it's amazing. Just the sound design as well in that moment. But I don't know. I don't know. How do you
Yeah.
feel? Like, do you think this is a movie that can potentially? I'm in my heart. I'm hoping. I'm gonna try to push it when Wicked Part Two comes out
Oh yeah.
later this year.
Oh, I love
It's
that.
like
Let's
you're
get on that
waiting for
agenda.
Wicked. You want more? You want more?
No, I'm a
It's
big
like
fan of
selling
that.
cocaine and drugs to
Right.
children, basically.
Standing
Do you
outside
like that?
the theater outside the theater with like DVD burned copies of Wild at Heart. Like, take one, take one. Um, I will say the one thing this has going for it is strange, but not in the way that I think anyone would be bored by it. Like, I understand if someone is bored by like really any other Lynch project. I don't think anyone would sit here and be like, "Oh my God, this is so tedious," like an Inland Empire, even a Mulholland Drive. Um, I think it will always remain probably a mixed and probably smaller film in his filmography, but also like to the point of like talking about is it haunting that people had that reaction at your cinema? It's always been a mixed film. Like obviously
Yeah.
Ebert, the known hater, I respect him for it. Honestly, known hater of
Oh,
Lynch,
hater.
didn't like this film shockingly, but like at the time it got mixed receptions. Like it's always been getting either you love it or you're not with it. So I guess maybe that's a little bit of reassurance. I will shout out Dune as being my number six David Lynch film. But yeah, I think forever this is going to be well. It's interesting, I guess, because also though so much of this is about again Americana of the past, and I do am curious if like kids were to watch this now or teenagers were to watch this now, would they really even like care or understand the Wizard of Oz references? I don't know. I guess Wicked would help with that. I don't know. I guess it's interesting. I'd be curious. I'd be very curious how this plays in the context of a generation who grew up on Wicked rather than the Wizard of Oz, because I think that is the generation right now where like if they associate those characters, they're going to associate it with Wicked. I'm very curious how that plays. But
I want to see the perspective of Marietta.
they're like, "Where's Ariana
She did enough
Grande? Where is she? Where's Ariana?"
coming down
yeah.
in the bubble. I can see her. I can see her. Squeaky voice.
Don't give up on love. Yeah, I can see it. But I think for what I guess I will say is I think for anyone who views this as a gem like we do and plenty of others do also, this is going to remain like a gem. I think there's always going to be people who like adore this film similar to all the other Lynch films. But I will say if you're listening, and I cannot believe you're an hour and 28 minutes into this podcast and you don't like Lynch or you haven't seen this film, but if you had someone who didn't like Lynch, they tried Mulholland Drive, they tried Inland Empire, they tried Eraserhead, they tried Elephant Man, and they just didn't connect with those, I would still push them to try this film. It's very unique in Lynch's filmography. And I previously said I had Blue Velvet as maybe the best introduction to Lynch. I think this probably is a great like number two try.
100%. 100%. That's actually what I did in uni with my flatmates. I first showed them Blue Velvet, and it was a hit. Surprisingly, they didn't love it, but it was a hit. I think this is what should solidify someone's interest and love for Lynch, or just completely kill it. I also think this is one to definitely show to the weirdos, or to the horny boys and the horny girls, because it is very sexy film, undeniably so, very steamy. It is very hot, just like also what you mentioned in the beginning. Just you can feel it, you can smell it. It is just like it's such a dirty, dirty movie, man. Just oh my god. Um, but it's great.
I don't know if he
It's
has.
great.
Okay, he has. I really feel like I need to get Jack Luke Sharp to watch this again and talk about it. I'm just so fascinated what he would think about it. In
What did he
27
say?
in 2017, he gave it 4 stars and a heart, so he really liked it in 2017. But I know he's changed some opinions since then. Because like this is one where
He's grown.
I don't know if he would come away being like this is the best movie ever made, or he'd be like it was a big misfire. But I feel like it has to be 5 stars or like 2 stars. Like I just it's so weird. This in context of Jack Lee Sharp is a fascinating conversation. But one day maybe one day we'll get there.
Okay. Well, one day I will have him on this
I wish he
podcast.
could read. I was about to say I wish he could read so he could be on this, but Sadly, I know.
He has promised me because I know it's like I'm a fisherman in this case. I have a good bait, and the bait was Wachowski. That was like Cloud Atlas, man. Let's do this.
So
It's a Cloud
true.
Atlas, man,
That's
episode. Come on, man. So maybe we'll see him. Stay tuned, listeners, if you want to hear
when you see the
from
9-hour
editor in
episode
chief.
drop, just know that's what it is. Just know Jack's finally on by the Wachowskis.
Are they reading Cloud Atlas? Like, nope. We're just talking about it. It will be a memorable episode. As was this one, I'm very happy we managed to talk about Wild at Heart, finally shining a light on Barry Gifford. I'm so happy because it's one of those books. When I first read it, I knew I was going to appreciate it down the line, and so having waited 7 years, 8 years to read it again, to actually get the full collection, to actually start reading it, loving it. I ended up reading Perdita Durango and I loved it. I was like, oh my god, this is even better because you wrote it after Tiananmen Square and all those things, and they are mentioned in the book.
Right.
Um,
So I've never, obviously, I don't know, obviously I've never read the series past this book. This is my first time reading. How does the series like play into the context of these characters? And like from you, I know you've read at least the second book, right? Like how does that affect your experience with it?
um, I don't know. Like, I usually try. We talked about it on this podcast as well in other occasions. I try to separate book universe, let's say, from film universe. Even with what you were saying, just like
Yeah.
the way it's hard to read the books not picturing these characters, but even like those moments of Sailor in the novel that you mentioned, um, you don't see Nicolas Cage's version
Right.
acting that way, right? Or feeling those feelings even potentially. So it's almost like they go into their own separate direction where um, I think I just find it interesting in what truly fascinates um, Barry Gifford as a writer, especially because he always spends very little time on the actual violence, on the actual action, like all those moments that are like I watched the adaptation of Perdita Durango. It's called Dance with the Devil for some stupid reason in English, but it is a primarily English production by Alex de la Iglesia, um, and it is an interesting companion piece, I would say, to Wild at Heart as a movie. Honestly, as a movie, but Wild at Heart came out at the best possible time, the film, which is 1990, aka 2 years before, or 1 year, whatever, before Reservoir Dogs came out, before everyone wanted to be Tarantino. And watching Perdita Durango is from 1997. It it's like a Robert Rodriguez, just like it has that vibe to it. It's like it's the Mexican loco, it's the guns and the thing. It's like it's close to the book, but it's not the same thing. They play it more for laughs as well. They do some fun stuff. Um, but yeah, no, I'm interested to see what happens. There's like one book is called Sailor's Holiday, and there's a chapter in it that says Marietta's trial. So I'm like, what the fuck is gonna happen in these books? I don't know, but I know the characters come back. From what I understand, I think Clifford himself, after the movie came out, ended up falling in love with them even more. And so he actually has them get together in some way. I don't know. It's going to be a wonderful journey. I'm looking forward to it. It's also going to be a short journey. Like reading the remaining four novels is shorter than other books I've planned for the next month on this podcast, which feels great. It's a nice way of like intercutting um, uh, the next couple of weeks of reading. Just like in one day, I'm gonna read one one Perry Gifford Sailor and Lula adventure. Are you interested actually in reading more from him?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I don't know if maybe I expressed it properly at the beginning, but like
Mm,
this darker sense of America, like Nathaniel West is like one of my favorite authors of all time. Like this darker, um, specifically when it ties to like American literature, but it's one of my favorite like genres. I thought this was like, I don't think I said this even when we were talking about the book. This was like a fantastic read. Like it really was like super engaging, super easy to get through. Like as you mentioned, some books are quite tedious to get through. If it's more writing like this, I would love to read the rest of his stuff. I mean, it really was great to read.
definitely worth it. And speaking of the book, was there a favorite quote that you have saved up from it that stood out, or a favorite scene?
I don't have any quotes prepared. I guess I'll go back to the scene we've always mentioned. The shockingness of turning around after telling someone that your uncle raped you and going into detail about that, and he's fully nude, erect on his bed, and there's so much nudity in the book also, and just so much erections. I don't know, that really, I guess, stuck in my head, for better or for worse.
The sweetest
Was a
cock.
shocking scene. Yeah, the sweetest cock. A shocking I think all the sex here is really interesting. Also, it's just interesting because I think so many novels, like, and so many, I guess, pieces of art in general try to like shy away maybe from sex and nudity and erections. The movie certainly does to a point, but so like it was pretty interesting reading a book that was so explicit with those things and so like not trying to like lessen them at all. I really appreciated it.
Postcoital conversations are not heavily featured in literature, you could say. Um, that's a good one. Now, there's so many moments. I read this the first book I ended up reading digitally because it's just easier for me to save quotes compared to the actual paper book, and I had 60 different quotes saved up because I was just reading it. I was like, "That's a good line." Shit, that's a good like back and forth. Oh fuck. So the one I ended up choosing for this, which kind of encapsulates the two characters from the book for me. Um, let me see if I can find it. Here it is. So it's a conversation that they're having after they're running away and they're around, and so you have Lula who says. I do trust you, sailor, like I ain't never trusted nobody before. It's scary sometimes. You ain't got much maybe or might in you. Sailor laughed and put his arm over Lula, brushing her cheek with his hand. Maybe and might are my little brothers, he said. I gotta set 'em a good example, is all. It ain't really them worries me. It's those cousins. Never and ever make me shake. It's just like, this dialogue, man. It's so good. It's so good. Which also just I love that Lynch read it and he was like, this actual conversation is not in the film, but so many others are. And I just respect him so much for saying he already did it great. I don't need to change much. I just can directly translate some of those things. But speaking of Lynch, then, do you have a favorite moment or quote from the film that really, really stood out to you? One of many, because I mean, of all the Lynch movies, like hard to pick.
There are a lot of quotes from Willem Dafoe, which are pretty great for like very different reasons than a lot of the rest of the movie. I keep coming back to the ending. I mean, as we kind of got into, like, I think that is a perfect scene when it comes to feeling just raw emotion. Um, from like the bubble on, I think it's genuinely perfect. But there are so many funny little lines here. Willem Dafoe talking about balls and stuff like it's great. Throughout, it is a really entertaining film. But that moment at the end is where I think it really cuts a lot of that corniness, and it's just like pure like revealing the work it's done to build these incredible emotions in these characters. And it's one that like it's a scene that will always stick in my head when I think about the greatest scenes ever seen.
It's perfect. It's a perfect moment. I do love. I love the soundtrack in general, but there's two sequences that have Chris Isaac's. Um, oh God, the game, Wicked Game. Sorry, which also ties into the Wicked Witch of the West. They have the mother on the actual broom riding alongside the car. It's such a cool shot. And that sequence goes into. Yeah, I was mentioning it earlier. You have a scene with a hitchhiker in the book that's not present in the film, and they change it here into a sequence where Sailor and Lula at night riding in the desert, they stumble upon a car crash, and they have Sherilyn Fenn, who's also from Twin Peaks, who's heavily concussed, heavily bleeding, and she's just dying. And it's based on an actual. I don't remember if it was like Lynch's experience or something, but it is based on like an actual thing that happened where apparently people when they have specific type of brain damage and they're just like losing consciousness or whatever, they just have the weirdest thoughts. And she's just worried about like misplacing her keys or like not finding her purse. It's like there's a car crash. The person you were with is like dead on the ground, and you're just like looking for this purse or whatever. And it's very upsetting. And that's one of the rare moments watching it in the cinema where the crowd was just like dead silent. There's nothing funny to take out of that sequence. It's just sad. But also, I love the car. I call it the car freakout scene, where it's one of the only moments where Lula is driving and she's just listening on the radio, which is present in the book. But the way that Lula reacts in the book, she's like, heck yeah, let's just listen to some radio. Oh my god, yeah, this is interesting. The serial killer and the crocodiles and the Ganji. But the way she plays it in the movie, Lola Dern, oh my god, Laura Dern, the way she plays it in the movie and the way she's written, she's horrified by all those things. She's just like trying to find some good ass music on the radio, and she just can't. She keeps finding terrible, upsetting world news. It's Night of the Living Dead. And, she stops the car. She asks Sailor to find some good music. He finds a rock tune. They start dancing. I love the move that Nick Cage pulls, where he's just like vaulting over the car. I don't know how he does it. Amazing. Um, and then that rock music, that intense rock music, just turns into the orchestral score of Badalamenti, and they hug each other and they kiss. And that's just cinema. That's just like, that's classical cinema. Lynch is at his core a very classical filmmaker. He experiments, of course, weirdness, but at his core he loves emotions, and that's just like so beautiful. It's just like, oh, I love that sequence. He
Because
plays it.
he's a really emotional guy. Like past the
He is.
filmmaking, I mean, there's that like very well known clip at this point. So I don't think like this is a revolutionary thing. But him on the set of Twin Peaks when he's filming again, and he sees her for the first time, and he's like overjoyed with like he is such an emotional guy, and I think that translates so well into his work. Again, so many of his films, I think, on the outside feel so cold, but you break down every single one, and there's such a warmth. Even like Eraserhead, which I think is very on the core, like, oh, this is weird and cold and dark and black and white, but inside is this father who is trying to figure everything out. Like, it's so warm, every single one of his films. It reminds me, not to not to keep going back to the bingo card, it reminds me of Schrader's comment, I think a couple years back in a Q&A, where he said, I wanted to make originally films that were saying fuck you, but now he just wants to have make films that say I love you. And I feel like that's
Oh,
something Lynch has done throughout his career. He's always a filmmaker when you break it down, that is ultimately reveling in the power of love and the cinema as love, and those warm emotions. Um, I think it's beautiful. Yeah.
beautifully put, Carson. Beautifully put. And let me ask you my last question. In the end, which version do you prefer? Do you prefer the book by Barry Gifford of Wild at Heart, or do you prefer the David Lynch adaptation?
I mean, I'm gonna pick the movie, but like the book, I cannot. Again, if you're this far into this episode, I don't know if this is gonna apply to you, but like, highly recommend you read the book first because I think the book is super worthwhile. And if you read the book second, there's just no way to shake the image of the film from it. I think it's highly, highly recommended that you read the book and then watch the movie. But for me, out of the two, the movie is just a little bit more impactful and a little bit more put together.
I completely agree, but I will also double down on just highly recommending the book, especially with the right expectations. I think going into it expecting what I did back then, which was just the wrong thing and not this what this book is about. Is just more action in terms of like people doing things instead of just people talking about things they know, read about, witnessed, heard. You know. Um, if you go in with those right expectations, I think it's a very rewarding book. And I would also recommend, yeah, at least Perdita Durango, but I can imagine the rest of the series is worth at least one read through. And it's not that long. There's Stephen King books that are way longer than this 7 book collection, so it's fine. It's fine. It's easy to handle, breezy read. And yeah, I'm very much glad, Carson, that we did this episode, that we had this conversation, that we managed to once again honor David Lynch. There might be more in the future. I'm planning a couple of maybe bonus episodes, some fun things, because why we can find a fun way to talk about Twin
Of course.
Peaks. Why not? Why not? There's books based on Twin Peaks. We can twist it around. Um,
And you've already done Dune, correct? So any listeners can go listen to that, right?
yes, we're
Yeah.
talking back in the days when we were doing 2 books per episode, which feels crazy in retrospect. I think was it it was paired with either.
Also, Dune is such a long book. That's crazy.
Oh my god, it was like Red Dragon or It or
Oh,
something like
Jesus.
that. Don't remember where we did.
It
I
and
can
Dune.
even
What a week.
I can even double check. Death by Adaptation,
And that was
Dune.
after the first Denis Villeneuve movie came out, I believe. So that's an interesting. I mean, I've listened to it before, but that's an interesting conversation to have. So highly recommend listeners go check it out.
Yeah, it was back when I think it had just come out. We're
Do
talking
you
about
prefer?
2021.
I'm sure we've talked about it. I just don't remember off the top of my head. Do you prefer? Would you say the Villeneuve films at this point, or do you prefer the Lynch vision?
I mean, I'm a Lynch stan.
Okay, good.
So
Correct.
deep in my heart, I prefer the
No, the
Lynch
Villeneuve. No,
version.
the Villeneuve novels or films are way below the Lynch film. Let's be clear.
Oh my god, I
Correct.
was right. We did talk about It and Dune in the same episode. It's 2 hours and 10. Those were the days. I don't know how we did it. Those were the days. Thankfully, in the past. Now we are doing proper, proper deep dives. But yes, no. Thank you so much, Carson, for this. Where can our listeners find you and hear your voice and read your thoughts on the interwebs?
You can find me on Blue Sky and Letterbox, just Carson Timar. If you want to listen to my voice, Clappercast comes out pretty much every week. Most of the time, maybe sometimes every other week. Reviewing random films in cinema, so some new releases, some older releases, as well as exclusive content on our Patreon. So if you want to hear my voice, there's plenty of it out there. And then also, what a joy to be on Anatomy of an Adaptation. Whenever I am, I think we've done 3 great episodes that I've been on since this return, and there's certainly more in the pipeline I'm excited for. So thank you for having me on.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. Being why you can follow me also on Blue Sky, on Instagram, and on Letterboxd, NickyGra97. You'll find me easily, or Nicolo Grasso. You can watch my short films and videos on YouTube and Vimeo at Enjoy the Movies. And of course, you can follow the podcast on Instagram to stay up to date with everything at Anatomy of Adaptation Pod. And of course, I've been doing it so far, but for people who don't know, if you're listening on Spotify or YouTube, subscribe, follow, like, 5 star, share, whatever rocks your boat. And links to everything that Carson mentioned and even previous episodes are in the show notes below. So
Also, can
thank
I
you so much.
quickly mention for anyone listening who hasn't
Sure.
already, because I feel like after a break, you probably have some new listeners. Do go check out the old episodes of this podcast. Like, even the ones just I'm on, there were some banger ones. Like, I know maybe like a 2 hour, I think it was, podcast on 50 Shades of Grey sounds maybe bad, but like, it was an incredible episode. And then even ones I'm not on, there are so many fantastic episodes. There are so many times I will read a book or think of a movie and I'll be like, oh, they should do that we should do it on an anime adaptation. I'll go back and it was already done. Like, definitely go in the archives because I think there's so much wonderful work here.
It's a lot of episodes. I want to say it was like 40 something, which considering it's books, it's not as quick usually to read through as movies. Go through as movies. That's I'm happy with it. I'm very happy with it, and I'm happy to be back. As I mentioned before, it's made me rekindle my passion for reading. Not on Kindles. We're not supporting Amazon or any of those things anymore. But yes, no. So there's more in the pipeline. There's more exciting episodes. I wish I could tease them more properly, but the schedule is what it is, so I never know what's actually coming out next. But yes, on average, once every 2 weeks at this point, we have a new episode. So thank you so much for listening, and we hope you have a fabulous day. Bye bye.